Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Climate change is leading to more frequent and intense disasters like flooding, hurricanes, and wildfires. But are governments ready to provide the support people need to bounce back? And are they doing so in a way that leaves no one behind?
Hello and welcome to Pullback, where we ask experts to explain big ideas so you get the full story behind the hype. Pullback is a proud member of the Harbinger Media Network of progressive Canadian podcasts. I'm Kyla Hewson, and I'm here with my co-host, Kristen Pugh.
On today's episode, we spoke with Dr. Samantha Montano, an assistant professor of emergency management at Massachusetts Maritime Academy, and author of the excellent book, Disasterology.
In this conversation, Samantha explained the counterintuitive reality that the people who most need support during a disaster tend to get less government assistance, and her suggestions for how emergency management can be reformed to support disaster justice. Let's get started.
When somebody experiences a disaster, I'm wondering if you could talk through some of the ways that it can affect them in their lives.
So depending on what exactly happens and what kind of damage that person experiences, you can really see a huge range in terms of how that affects their lives. So it can be everything from physical damage to where they've been living and then becoming displaced because of that. It could mean that they have lost their car or their means of transportation. They could have lost their job because where they've worked has been destroyed. Their social networks can be disrupted as other people around them experience impacts. And then, of course, there's the physical and mental impacts that somebody might experience depending on, what exactly has unfolded.
What I really liked about your book, Disasterology, is that you're sort of speaking not only from this expert perspective, because you've done a lot of research on disasters and disaster response, but also you sort of speak a little bit to your personal involvement on the front lines of disaster response. So I'm wondering, sort of from those dual perspectives, can you maybe talk about how, like, for some people, a disaster might really impact their life for a much longer period than for others, and why that happens?
I think if you haven't personally really been through a major disaster before, you might not really understand that it's not just when the hurricane is there or the wildfire is there that somebody is, having to deal with this disaster, though the repercussions of that event can last for a very, very long time. Recovery in many cases lasts for many years. It can last decades in some cases. Some people never really may recover from that event. So I think it's really important, the media comes in and covers that response component of the disaster, or hopefully they do, but they're very rarely there in recovery. Just to give you one specific example, Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005, but New Orleans is still very much working on recovery projects. There is still money coming from the Federal Emergency Management Agency to New Orleans every single year for recovery projects. There are still individuals who had wanted to come back and were not able to rebuild their homes. There are still volunteer groups that are actively using volunteers to help rebuild homes. It's been 18 years. So just to, give you kind of an example of really how significant these events can be.
You mentioned that word recovery. I'm wondering, for somebody that doesn't know a lot about disaster response and rebuilding and all those things, can you talk a little bit about what sort of the different phases are in emergency management and what they kind of look like?
So the one that everybody usually thinks of is the response. So that is where you're doing these life-saving measures to protect life and property. That's the flashing lights. Hollywood disaster movies are made about that phase. But that actually is normally a relatively short period of time. Then you have this recovery, which is putting everything back together, hopefully making some changes in that community so that event doesn't happen again. That, is really the time-consuming phase. And then before you ever get to response and recovery, you also have preparedness, which is where you are readying yourself to go through a response and recovery. This is the stockpiling supplies and the making plans and doing trainings and exercises. And then you also have a fourth phase, which we call mitigation, hazard mitigation, which is where you are actually trying to prevent that disaster from happening. You're trying to, minimize your risk to various types of hazards that you might experience.
Thanks. I think that's really helpful for people to understand that there's sort of like these different phases and they all have their own functions and exist at different times.
And each of them is really important too, right? Like you really have to look at it as this kind of comprehensive model and really work across all four phases. Like in the US, we have historically not prioritized mitigation. We've been very reactive. This is true in many countries too. We've been really reactive, kind of only dealing with the response, only dealing with the recovery when something actually happens. And for a very, very long time, folks in emergency management have been arguing, we really have to be putting more resources into mitigation, more resources into preparedness to try and, minimize those impacts that we're seeing in response and recovery.
Let's talk a little bit about the resources that people can draw on when they're affected by a disaster. Can you talk about some of the different forms of assistance that might be available?
I'll talk in the US context here, but it's often similar in other countries as well. So generally what we see from the research is that when somebody experiences a disaster, they tend to rely on their own resources first. So if, let's just say they have to rebuild their house, they are going to look to their savings accounts. If they have them, they are going to look to their insurance companies if they have insurance, and they're going to try and kind of use the resources they have on their own to cover those expenses. Once those run out, which very often they do, they are going to be looking towards their broader social network. So this is like their friends, their family, neighbors, coworkers, online social networks, GoFundMe accounts, other kind of sources of help. This might be monetary. It could also be, going to stay at your friend's house for a couple weeks while your house is repaired. So, various kind of help from your social network. And then there is institutional aid, which can come in a couple different forms. So this would include government aid. It would also include aid from nonprofit organizations. So for nonprofits, this could be volunteers coming to help clear out your house. It might be trying to get like a grant that a nonprofit is offering to help fix some aspect of your home. And then you have government aid. And so again, in the US, there is some individual assistance that could come through FEMA. We also have some loans that can be taken out. You might also rely on some of other like social safety net type programs. We see disaster survivors go onto food stamps or start taking unemployment insurance and kind of just piecemeal those programs together to meet whatever their needs are. So I would say that probably most survivors use aid from multiple sources, right? And you're kind of going back and forth to these different sources as the recovery unfolds, as you learn that actually, we're not going to get as much money from insurance as we had anticipated. So now we have to go to government, or, a new nonprofit shows up a year after. So now there's more assistance than there may have been initially. So it's definitely not a linear process in terms of accessing those various sources of aid. It's definitely a very piecemeal approach in terms of, you really have to, it takes a lot of work to navigate all of these different sources and figure out, how much you can get and from where and how that matches up with what your needs are.
And I would also imagine that depending on your circumstance prior to a disaster, having to dip into sort of personal savings and stuff can be much more of a problem for some people than others.
Yeah, so definitely class is going to affect every aspect of how somebody recovers. So, if you are independently wealthy and you have millions and millions of dollars in your savings account, then you're going to be able to probably cover the expenses related to your recovery. You are not living on the brink of homelessness, right? You are still going to have to go through that recovery process. You may still have long-term mental repercussions, but in terms of, physically having a roof over your head, it's probably not going to be an issue. Whereas if you are one of the many people who is living paycheck to paycheck, doesn't have much money in savings account, then you are immediately going to be thrown into a much, much more dire situation. And again, in the US, I mean, we have many disaster survivors who are living on the brink of homelessness, meaning not just that their home is destroyed, but meaning that they don't have anywhere to go. We have disaster survivors sleeping in their cars. We have them sleeping in tents on their property while they try to rebuild their homes. It's a really dire situation for many people.
I think I saw a stat somewhere in something that you wrote. It doesn't take a very large disaster to really be financially devastating for somebody. Something like $400.
Yeah, I think what you're thinking of is a study that was done in the US that found that most people can't afford, I think it's a $600 emergency, something around there. And when you start adding up the cost of a response, let alone a recovery, you can go through $600 extremely quickly. Doing, these like large scale hurricane evacuations that we have to do, something like that. I mean, you're potentially talking about thousands of dollars to be able to personally evacuate. You have the cost of transportation out. If you have a car, you're going to have to be buying gas. You are probably going to be paying for a hotel room for days, potentially weeks. You have all the expenses because you're not at home that you're now having to pay, things that you forgot at home that now you need, like your kids need more clothes than you brought with you, right? Like all of these expenses just really add up so quickly. And that's before you even get to, and now I have to rebuild my entire house, right? Like most people do not have enough money in the bank to be able to just rebuild an entire house. The gap between what people really have in their savings and what is needed to be able to go through any of these events is pretty big.
So a lot of the work that you've done has sort of looked at FEMA's disaster assistance and disaster recovery. And even though the Canadian system is not identical, I think a lot of the same problems exist. So people will find it interesting. So what are some of the problems with FEMA and how it approaches disaster assistance?
FEMA is the agency at the federal level responsible for emergency management. So they are supposed to be working across all four of those phases that we talked about. So that's admittedly like quite a large mission that we have given this one agency. And I guess maybe I'll just kind of walk through the phases. So in terms of mitigation, the federal government has recently in the past few years put more money towards mitigation across the country. I believe this past year we had over $1 billion in mitigation funding for state and local governments, which is great. Still not enough. We definitely need more. In terms of the equity of how mitigation dollars are being spent through FEMA, we do have a pretty serious problem there. When you look at kind of where those mitigation dollars, which communities those dollars are going towards, you see that it's tending to go to benefiting whiter, wealthier communities. And there are some reasons for that kind of baked into how the grant process is structured. So localities are having to apply for those grant dollars through kind of competitive like grants. And if you are a poorer community, you probably don't have the capacity at the local level to really put those grant proposals together. They're pretty complex. We've created the systemic problem here where the communities who really need those mitigation dollars most and who probably have the highest risk aren't necessarily able to access those dollars. So kind of a mixed bag with mitigation. Good that we have more money, not so great that the communities who need those dollars most aren't getting them right now. In terms of preparedness, FEMA is overseeing various things at the national level, things like the national stockpile that came up during COVID. They're doing all kinds of planning, leading all kinds of trainings, and they do exercises for things like the Cascadia earthquake that will one day happen. So they're doing kind of those classic preparedness things. In terms of like dollars going to the local level, that's through one single grant program called EMPG, which seeks to build the capacity at the local level. So this connects back with this mitigation problem, right? That these EMPG dollars, we need to increase the amount of money going to local governments through that program. That would be really kind of like a helpful thing that would help us across all the phases. FEMA's involved in responses. Obviously, when something happens, they're going to deploy various federal resources. We have some like urban search and rescue teams, things along those lines that FEMA oversees. But probably the thing FEMA spends the most time doing really is recovery. So FEMA is picking up the check for a lot of these recoveries across the country. The kind of process that we go through in the US is that a governor needs to request a presidential disaster declaration when they feel that their state's resources have been overwhelmed, and that is approved by the president. And once that happens, FEMA is able to provide various resources for the recovery, kind of, again, depending on what exactly has happened. And those recovery programs are structured kind of into two categories. We have public assistance, which is money going to fixing infrastructure, kind of public related needs, things like debris removal. And then you have the individual assistance programs, which I mentioned earlier, which provides hopefully some amount of money to individuals for their recovery related needs.
Let's maybe like talk through some of the problems. Maybe we can focus on the assistance side, even though I think the mitigation point you're making is really important too. So one of the things that you've pointed to is the time that it can take to get assistance from FEMA. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
First of all, something that's important to understand is that not everybody who experiences a disaster is going to be getting aid from FEMA. It's actually a relatively small group of people that are even going to make it through kind of all the hurdles to be eligible. So you have to be in a disaster that has gotten a presidential disaster declaration. They don't all get that. You have to be in a county that has received approval for individual assistance. So just because there's a disaster declaration for your disaster does not mean individual assistance has been approved. And then even within individual assistance, there's kind of like different programs that they may open, like rebuilding versus like healthcare cost recovery related needs. So there's kind of different programs in there that they may or may not utilize. So if you make it through all of those requirements, then you still as an individual have to go and apply for aid from FEMA. And that application process actually kind of evolves year to year. They're like kind of constantly changing it. But generally it looks like, providing all of your personal information, going through the damages that you have to show that you have already tried to get money from insurance and that it wasn't enough. And, so you have to really kind of plead your case to FEMA of why you have nowhere else to go to get help. And you submit that information to FEMA. And one of the problems right now is that a lot of people are being denied aid simply for things like forgetting to put their zip code on their address or, these little kind of stupid things that like, you've just been through a disaster, like you're not like, thinking fully right, or you have somebody who English isn't their first language or, something along those lines. And so people keep getting denied. And so then you have to appeal. And so we don't have the exact number, but there's anecdotal stories of people having to go through the appeals process like 5 times before they get this money from FEMA. Obviously, in that process, a lot of people give up. They're like, I can't figure this out. This isn't worth it. So it's just these like bureaucratic red tape that people are having to try and navigate through. And then this is the kicker, is that even if you get approved by FEMA for individual assistance, you're probably not going to be getting that much money. The number changes year to year. And I believe this year it's like maybe $32,000. But that's the most that you can get. And yeah, that's a chunk of change. Certainly, it's not enough to rebuild a house, right? Like maybe if you have some damage, it's enough, but it's not enough to make somebody whole in terms of all of the expenses that somebody would have in recovery. And that's the most you can get. On average, across the country, people are getting $4,000 to $6,000 from FEMA. And there are many people who get $1,000 or, less even. So to go through that entire process and only get a couple $1,000s, at a certain point, it's like, this isn't worth it.
Yeah. I mean, it also, that sort of time and uncertainty seems like it probably doesn't provide the best incentives to recover well?
Yeah, there's a lot to be said here. I mean, I think one of our, key goals of recovery is to have communities build back in a way that minimizes their risk of this happening again. And in order to do that, you need more resources, not less, right? And so it's almost impossible for a community in the US to build back in a way that minimizes their risk to the next disaster. Like it just, there isn't the money for it to happen at this point. That is something that's really frustrating. Like we're losing that opportunity to minimize our risk. And we're also really compounding our vulnerability. Like it's even worse than that. Like we're actually building communities that are even more vulnerable to the next disaster because we're not even recovering in any kind of holistic way, right? And we've seen this along the Gulf Coast, for example, in Southwest Louisiana, where they've had multiple hurricanes and other types of disasters all within the span of a couple of years. Those communities are more vulnerable to each disaster that has happened because they hadn't recovered from the previous one. And so you're really just compounding your risk. You're not eliminating that risk, certainly. And instead of like having the bandwidth for survivors and communities to be thinking about eliminating risk in the long term, they're instead, arguing with FEMA over a couple $1,000s.
Yeah. And in addition to sort of making communities less resilient on the whole, it seems to me that this kind of problem also widens like the inequities in a community. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what are the groups that tend to get left out for various reasons or receive less or, have it take a really long time to receive assistance?
Yeah. So in the US, I would say the group that overall gets the least amount of assistance are people who are undocumented. So FEMA does not give any money to people who are undocumented. Of course, those folks tend to be already living in a financially precarious situation. They are already not having strong work protections that is amplified in the disaster context. They are less likely to go and seek out assistance because they are worried that they will be arrested. And so folks who are undocumented kind of, I think, stand out as being kind of the most vulnerable in these situations in terms of their ability to get aid. From there, I think, anybody who is in a financially precarious place going into that disaster, communities of color tend to have greater impacts from the actual event and then also have fewer resources to be able to address that in the recovery. The elderly is another group where we see, a lot of folks that are living on fixed incomes who don't have necessarily like the physical ability to go fix their house themselves, who are, very dependent on other kinds of services that may have been disrupted by the disaster. And in terms of like death tolls in disasters, it tends to be the elderly who die disproportionately. And then, you also have disabled folks, people who have other kind of like physical limitations, not just thinking about like rebuilding a house or something, but also just in terms of being able to go down to town hall to get the permits you need, right? If you have anything that, people who don't have cars or don't have access to public transportation, all of them would kind of start falling through the cracks of this recovery system and end up being kind of the last to recover. We don't have like perfect data on this, but there was a study done after Katrina that found women of color who were single mothers were the last kind of group of people to recover following Katrina. So that kind of gives you a sense of where obviously those identities are intersecting.
From what I've heard, there have been some racial discrimination lawsuits about disaster responses. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there have. One kind of notorious one was in New Orleans following Katrina, related to a federally funded program called the Road Home program, which gave kind of extra recovery dollars to New Orleanians. They kind of tapped out the individual assistance money pretty quickly in that situation. And so Congress passed additional funding because it became clear that homeowners in New Orleans just needed more money or they were not going to be able to rebuild kind of across demographics, really, because, 80% of the city had been flooded. And so In the Road Home program, you have federal dollars being administered through the state. And what they found was that the homeowners who are living in whiter, wealthier neighborhoods were getting more money because their homes had been valued higher prior to the storm, which was how they were kind of determining how much money somebody was getting. So somebody who owned, it could be the exact same house, but if it was in the Lakeview neighborhood, they were going to get more money than if they were in the historically Black neighborhood of the lower Ninth Ward. And so what happened was that, money was disproportionately going to the whiter communities in New Orleans. There were various lawsuits filed, and I think they were settled eventually. But that's a good example where, you have kind of baked into these recovery formulas that we're using, you have this inequity baked into them.
I wonder if we could talk about renters a little bit, because I think in people's sort of popular imagination of disasters, a lot of the sort of assistance revolves around rebuilding a home that somebody owns, but renters can experience slightly different challenges.
So if you are a renter, any mitigation that happens to the place you're living, any recovery work that's done after is at the discretion of your landlord or whoever owns your building. And you have very little control over any of that in terms of being able to protect yourself proactively, but then also kind of in the aftermath here. Renters are in certainly kind of a very different situation than homeowners tend to be in. On the one hand, some renters may be in a position to be able to say, well, everything's destroyed. Bye. See you later. I'm out of here. Right. Where if you're a homeowner, you can't necessarily do that. So there are in some ways, I'm a renter. I live right next to the ocean. I tend to fall into that category where I'm just out of here if this place floods. Potentially you're in a better situation, right? You still lost all your stuff, but you don't have to rebuild anything. So however, that requires there to be other housing for you to move into and for you to have enough money to put down a deposit and potentially fight to get out of a lease with your old land. There's still issues there, and it can still cost a lot of money. And if there isn't other housing, then where do you go, right? There are many people who are renting who are trapped in leases where their landlord is telling them, well, no, you're responsible for cleaning this up. Which a lot of shady things going on here with landlords and whatnot. And, helping folks who are renting, be able to navigate that can be really complicated. There can be a lot of lawsuits that kind of come out of these rental situations. FEMA does have a recovery program that helps with rental assistance. So again, even if they fix your apartment that you're living in, you still might have to replace everything you have. So again, you still do have these expenses. So that extra rental assistance can be really helpful to be able to put other money towards those other needs.
Let's talk a little bit about climate change and how climate change is impacting all of this. I've got some specific questions, but do you have an overall reaction you want to offer first?
Yeah, in terms of climate change and disasters, what I would say is that climate change is underlying all of this, right? It's making every single thing we do in emergency management more complicated and more urgent. So we've always needed to do mitigation, but now it's no, we really need to do mitigation now. It's speeding up the number of disasters we have. So it means we're having to respond more frequently, which is putting strain on those responses. We saw that in the 2017 hurricane season, where FEMA just became completely overwhelmed by the time we got to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And then you have, like I mentioned, places like Southwest Louisiana that are getting kind of stuck in these cycles of recovery. So climate change is just underlying the entire process.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about insurance specifically, because there are some challenges. You had mentioned that insurance is sort of one of the major ways that people receive support after a disaster, but climate change is causing some challenges, is it not?
Well, look, insurance was never the end all be all in terms of recovery, but it has certainly been the case where if you have insurance, that has traditionally been thought of as being kind of the best way for somebody to get a lot of money to be able to recover. That was the biggest pool of money that people were really pulling from. And it worked okay for the most part. Unfortunately, as we've seen this increase in disasters, They are pulling policies in certain communities that have a really high risk. I think there's a huge question of how far they're going to take that, right? There are, pretty large swaths of Louisiana and California and Florida where you cannot get insurance or it is prohibitively expensive. I mean, just like thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars that, nobody can afford. And so we have that issue. There's also a secondary issue with insurance companies, which I think is on the increase. And again, we don't have the best data on this, but I am hearing more frequently from survivors. And I mean, like every survivor I talk to is saying that their insurance company is not paying out, right? They have insurance. They've been paying into it for years. And the insurance company will, come and send somebody and they'll say, well, no, that wasn't damaged from this, or it'll only cost you $10,000 to replace your entire foundation or something like ludicrous along those lines. And so folks are really having to battle their insurance companies. Some of them are trying to sue them, but suing an insurance company requires, a whole nother set of resources and is another traumatic process that somebody has to go through. So they're not actually giving people money in recovery. And then secondarily, they aren't even giving some policies in some places, which is not only a problem in terms of like, then that homeowner doesn't have money for recovery potentially, but it also creates a problem with that person, trying to sell their house. Like the value of your home is tremendously affected by not being able to have insurance there. So there's these like other really scary, like rippling repercussions about what this means for the real estate and the housing market overall in the not too much long term, like this is like creeping up on us very fast in certain states.
And I mean, I think another thing about climate change and its sort of nexus with disasters is it's kind of changing the sort of landscape of risk, and it's posing these questions around like, do we really want to rebuild a community in some cases? And I'm wondering if you have any sort of thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely one of these massive questions that's just hanging over all of us, I think, is if we want to be taking this long-term perspective of our risk and think about, how we build sustainable communities for the long term, there are going to be some pretty difficult decisions that we are starting to make now, right? You have some places like Isle de Jean Charles off the coast of Louisiana, which was a native island community that has been, at this point, fully moved inland. They are having to move in part because of climate change. And that, I think, is really scary for other communities who kind of see that on their horizon for themselves. I mean, I take the stance here that it is up to each community to decide what they want for their future. If, you are a coastal community that is destroyed and you want to rebuild, do you think you can get another 15 years there? Then I think in a country like the US where we do have the resources to do that theoretically, then okay, fine, let's do it. But because moving a community is itself incredibly traumatic, like moving communities is not something we want to do, right? That is like the worst case scenario, I think, for us in terms of thinking about kind of how to handle this risk. At the same time, do you really want a community to go through, 3 major storms and go through that trauma when they could have just moved in the first place, right? I don't think there is like a perfect answer there, which is why I think that having communities make that decision is kind of the approach that has to be taken here. But then there's also certainly the equity issue here in making sure that if a community or even a person wants to move out of that risk, that there is a pathway for them to do that there's government funding for buyout programs, and that we're not leaving people on their own to try and figure that out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good sort of bridge to talk about disaster justice. So I'm wondering if you could tell us sort of what, from your perspective, disaster justice looks like.
Disaster justice is obviously very rooted in like the broad concept of social justice and overlaps in various ways with environmental and climate justice. But for me, disaster justice is doing everything we can to eliminate the root causes of our risk. And then to the extent that we can't do that, because we do want to be realistic, to the extent that we can't do that, how can we approach preparedness, response, and recovery in the most effective and equitable way possible? Disaster justice for me is about prioritizing, eliminating those root causes, connecting in with like the racial equity movements, gender justice movements, right? Like all of those other existing movements, supporting those. And then to the extent that, that isn't enough, to make sure that from an emergency management standpoint, we are approaching things as equitably as possible.
Let's maybe think about like implementation a little bit. What do you think is sort of needed to change the disaster, run the gamut across the cycle? What would you need for a system that leaves nobody behind and that fulfills that sort of vision of disaster justice?
One thing to start with is that I don't think we are in a position of needing to completely throw out our emergency management system and start from scratch. And in fact, I think because of the urgency of the climate crisis, we actually can't do that without really harming a lot of communities. So I think we need to figure out how to work with what we have. And I think that, following this 4-phase model, for example, we know from the research that doing that comprehensively works really well. So I think we just need to build on this. One thing that I think is most important, like the first thing that we need to do, is build the capacity of local emergency management agencies. In the US, we have a lot of part-time emergency managers. This is not a part-time job, right? You are having to do mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. This is a full-time job, and it's a full-time job realistically for multiple people. So we need to radically increase the funding at that local level. They're the ones that are entrenched in those communities, that know those communities best, that are that first line of kind of defense when something happens. So that's something where local communities need to be putting more money towards that. The states and federal government all need to be directing more money towards those agencies. And that also is going to help you across all 4 phases, right? So this is kind of this like underlying change that could be made. That would be a really good starting point.
So, okay, we need sort of more personnel to be dealing with this problem in general. What would good disaster assistance look like?
Well, in terms of like recovery, it would look like more money more quickly to people with less strings attached, right? And we've seen this in other contexts too, by the way. Like, this isn't unprecedented. Like, if you look at the approaches that some groups are taking in like refugee crises, right? That's what they do. They give cash to people as quickly as possible and trust that those people are going to use that money in the way that is needed to most meet their needs, right? In the US, we are so paranoid about fraud that it's preventing us from being able to help people in the way that we could. So more money to more people more quickly is kind of the most obvious thing here. And then I think from there, you go to designing programs that more specifically meet the needs of a more diverse group of people, rather than having this system that is largely meant to be one size fits all, right? When we know that people experience recoveries in different ways. Part of the challenge here is a lot of these changes aren't changes that can be made by emergency managers, right? Like, to really address the mental health issues in recovery, one, you're going to address that by shortening that recovery time. But you also need like an infrastructure, like a mental health infrastructure to support. And you need that to be in the local community, and you need people to be able to access it. So these broader kind of social problems that we have in the US have a huge effect on how this is playing out, right? Like, not everybody having access to health insurance is a huge problem for us in emergency management, which is why, like, I would say from an emergency management perspective, supporting things like, healthcare for all is important for us, and connects in with how we're reducing people's risks, making sure that there is a robust, mental health infrastructure in local communities is good, not only in the day to day, right, but also in these contexts where there are these emerging mental health crises.
I mean, you point to the example of healthcare, but in general, like all elements of the safety net, the stronger they are, the better it is for disaster resilience, for sure. One thing you've also talked about in some of your writing is the need for some more oversight on, for example, things like insurance company profiteering. Do you want to talk about that at all?
There was an investigation done after Sandy, and they were looking at the insurance companies that were profiting off of the National Flood Insurance Program. So we have this kind of one really good case study of that. But certainly as you look across the country, right, you have all these insurance company, again, kind of anecdotally here, you have all these insurance companies collecting all of these premiums from people and then not paying out. Where is this money going, right? So there is certainly a need for extensive oversight of the insurance industry kind of across the board in terms of all of their practices as it relates to these various hazards. Then you also have other companies that are getting these massive government contracts to do these tasks that we need to do in recovery. So debris removal is probably the biggest one here. We are spending billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars every single year on debris removal. That is incredibly important. Like, we have to get the debris out of there to be able to do anything else in recovery. We need people to come in and do that really quickly. However, we also know that these companies are making a ton of money off of this. And I do think there is an ethical question there. There's been some other reporting from local journalists in Kentucky looking at the practices of the debris removal companies there. They're getting paid for the weight of the debris that they collect. And then you hear stories of people having their homes scooped up and taken away by a debris company, and they didn't want their home to be taken away by a debris company, right? There's really like very serious, nefarious things that seem to be going on here. And there is an incredible lack of oversight in Congress specifically. FEMA is trying, it would seem, but the scale of what is happening, I think, is so great that Congress isn't doing a good job of oversight. And then also the media hasn't really done much oversight here either. There was like that one example of the journalists in Kentucky, but there's very little reporting on recovery in general, and even less reporting on holding any of these companies accountable for what they're doing. There's not many researchers who are studying this component either. So there's not accountability, but we also don't even have like a full picture of what exactly is happening with all of these contracts, which I think is almost even more concerning.
One thing I've been thinking about lately is, especially when you were sort of talking about the inequities in sort of disaster funding, is thinking about the application of the Justice 40 commitment that had been made. And I understand it applies to some sort of like IRA investments, but not most other federal money. Is that part of the solution, maybe?
It's definitely all connected, right? I think with these like bigger initiatives that we have, the way they are written on paper seem great, right? Even something like the infrastructure bill that was passed, like, oh, well, like all this money, we're going to integrate climate change into how we're like spending this money. All of those things sound great on paper. I am like a very practical person here. And so I always want to see, how is that actually going to be implemented in practice, right? How is this actually going to play out? And I think it's just kind of too soon to really know that for sure at this point. I think like the potential is there, but all of this really depends on how it actually plays out, right? Like you can also give a whole bunch of money to a community who really needs money, but if it's not spent in a way that actually reduces their risks, or, it just all goes to contractors who, are using all these sketchy subcontractors, well, then I don't know that it's, done what it's supposed to be doing. So I think that there's real kind of potential there in terms of kind of how the Biden administration has addressed dealing with environmental justice issues. But, I think we just can't know yet, unfortunately. But I do think we need to be really good about, constantly kind of being on the administration and like advocating and pushing for accountability in their follow through of, those various approaches.
All right. So I think I've been through all the questions that I wanted to ask, but I'll maybe give you some space to say whatever sort of parting words you want to add.
We covered a lot of ground here, and I know that this can sound like really bad, and it is really bad, but also it is important to know that there are solutions here, and we have a really good grasp of what the problems are in emergency management. And I think we also have a pretty good grasp on what the solutions are. So it really, I think at this point, is a matter of getting those solutions implemented, which requires reform and it requires policy change. Like, these are policy problems that we're talking about. And getting the US Congress to do anything at this point is a bit of a challenge. But I do think that this is actually one issue where a lot of people can come together and there can be bipartisan support in a way that other issues may not have, just because these disasters are affecting every single community across the country. There are some little glimmers of policy hope in terms of kind of bipartisan support for certain changes that I think could kind of snowball into the future to these bigger reforms. That said, it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of organizing and advocacy to make that happen. But I still see a path forward. I still think it's possible. So that is something that I think we can all kind of hang on to as we're in the trenches fighting for these things.
So, Kyla, what'd you think?
I think that any work that gets done in the face of natural disasters is important. But I really liked the way that Samantha drew attention to the fact that, like, we could be thinking about it so much more efficiently. Like, before the disaster happens, maybe we should think about stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true. And I really enjoyed the way that Samantha in this conversation really broke down the experiences that people have during a disaster, because it's something that I know because I've done frontline disaster assistance, but it's really hard to conceptualize what happens during an evacuation unless you've either seen it directly or lived it. I really just think that that's valuable information for people to have, because otherwise, when you get into a disaster situation, it can be a real emotional shock and it can be really surprising. The services really are not oftentimes as good as people might expect, particularly if you're sort of in the middle class bend. And it's worth thinking through what you would do in a disaster, but it's also really worth us paying attention not only to the first sort of like 2 weeks after a wildfire hits or flooding happens or a hurricane occurs, but to actually think through what's happening to these communities 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years later, because the recovery process really does last that long. And because there's less public attention on it, as Samantha pointed out in this interview, there's really less money that goes towards it. And so when you think about things like suicides, bankruptcies, debt, the really negative outcomes that happen out of a disaster, most of them are actually occurring several years later. And they're happening in ways that are really silent and uncounted right now. So I thought this was a really important conversation to have.
While I was listening to Samantha talk, I kept thinking about the book, The Great Displacement by Jake Biddle. And I think it's a book that everybody should read because it really goes into the detail of how communities are affected by disaster in a way that I couldn't have comprehended beforehand. But after having read that book, I'm like, oh yeah, of course, all of these people are being left behind. And of course, people who were well off before a disaster sometimes end up better off afterwards. Like, it's so messed up, and it wouldn't be that hard to plan ahead. And we know that we're going to be having more disasters in the coming years. The fact that governments are really globally sticking their heads in the sand about it and pretending like every sort of 100-year flood that we get every 3 or 4 years is never going to happen again. It's a little bit mind-boggling, and we just can't keep going that way if we want to adapt to this new world we're living in.
Yeah, and we really need to think about our disaster response systems as well, I would say. A lot of the conversation with Samantha focused on the context of America and FEMA, and in many ways, they are further ahead than Canada because they do have a centralized emergency management agency, whereas in Canada, the way it works is there's basically what I like to call reimbursement telephone for disaster assistance. So like It's primarily the responsibility of municipalities, but when a disaster is big enough that it becomes catastrophic for a municipality, they'll go to the province. And then if it's of a sufficient scale, they'll then go to the federal government for reimbursement. And so ultimately, there's like a funding system that's backed, but it happens retroactively, and there's no federal emergency management system. So like on the ground, some municipalities are super good at disaster assistance. Calgary's amazing at it. But there are other communities that are a little bit less prepared, and some may have sort of structural constraints. And so we end up relying on nonprofit organizations like the Canadian Red Cross, which, you know, they do a good job, but it leaves some gaps as well. So if you're listening to this conversation and thinking, as I think a lot of us often do when we're hearing American stories, like, oh, it can't be that bad in Canada, it must be fine. It's not. We have a lot of the same problems in the Canadian context. There are a lot of challenges that people experience when they get into the recovery phase of disaster, and there's a lot less support unless you've got really good insurance coverage. And even in that case, a lot of the times, like let's say you live in interior BC and you've purchased a home that's like a generation old, you probably do not have enough insurance coverage, even if your insurance coverage is good, to be able to build back a new house on that same property, because you're going to have to go through a whole bunch of new standards, and like the building costs are going to be more expensive because it's hard to bring things in and everybody's going to need to be rebuilding.
Yeah, and I like that you brought up the interior BC example, because as time goes on, as we're getting more and more wildfires happening, fewer and fewer people are even able to get insurance anymore. And so, you know, insurance is really not a good solution in a lot of cases for a lot of communities, because they're just not insuring for the things that are actually probably going to happen, right? Like wildfires.
Yeah. The other thing is we lack a lot of information about this kind of thing. There's nobody that's really tracking sort of the long-term social ramifications of disasters in a comprehensive way. And certainly in Canada, it's a huge data gap. There's more on it in the United States. And so Samantha was able to speak to some of those racial inequities. But really, there's some research on First Nations contexts in Canada, and the results, unsurprisingly, not good, as one might expect. But we need to put more money into studying this stuff, and we need to put more money into protecting people, I would say.
Yeah, I think my takeaways from this episode were we need to be more proactive in our thinking and planning for how we're going to react when a disaster does happen. It needs to be a federal initiative. And yeah, we need to be studying it, because right now we're all just pretending like nothing bad is ever going to happen. And then something bad happens and the insurance companies are the ones we're going to. And famously, they don't like to give money away. So like, you know, even if you do have the insurance, you're going through this, like, if you've just lost your home and you've been displaced, one of the last things you're going to want to have to do is jump through the red tape and the hoops that insurance companies are going to put up for you to have to deal with it.
Yeah. And it's also like, it takes a long time for some of this stuff to happen. Like it can be 2, 3, 4 years, and you may not have any ground broken on a new home. That can mean massive challenges for people, right? Like it can mean interrupted income if, say, there's nowhere in your community you can find housing. So maybe you live in a more rural context, or maybe your entire town was destroyed, as in the case of Lytton. And, you know, you may not have a grocery store nearby. You may not have a road system that can easily get you to your job. And you've got to find housing that is within like your affordability range. And that may not be easy to do. So what happens in a lot of cases is people will end up being housed like an hour or two away from their community while they're waiting for rebuilding to happen. And they end up taking on a lot of debt because the insurance coverage isn't quite enough to rebuild their house. And this is people that are in like a good situation, relatively speaking, because they are able to be insured.
Yeah, if you're a renter, forget about it. Like none of the, you know, like if you're a renter, it just sucks. It just sucks.
Yeah. If you're a renter and you're evacuated for a month, you are going to probably be on the hook for paying rent while you're evacuated. And we know that over half of Canadians don't have tenants insurance. And so you're probably also paying out of pocket for your housing. Unless you're lucky enough to be in BC, where they do pay for it for a considerable period of time. It's not always the case across Canada.
I think it's one of the heavier episodes to think about, because nobody wants to think about a disaster affecting them. But honestly, if you sit down and you have a plan for your family, it makes it easier when something does happen. And something happening is becoming a more likely scenario by the day in every community.
Yeah, I think this is such an important topic. And I think that people can actually do quite a lot to get this higher on the policy radar. If this is something you care about, do everything that Samantha says, get involved. But in addition to that, think about both the preventive and the responsive ways that we can deal with this, right? Maybe check out to see if your municipality has flood maps. See whether you're in a flood zone, first of all. See whether the municipality is allowing you to build in a flood zone. And if they are, that might be something you want to raise with your member of like your local councillor. And then sort of at the other end of the spectrum, you can advocate for disaster justice in your community, or maybe join a nonprofit that does disaster justice, because there's always a need for volunteers.
We are grateful to be learning and unlearning on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, as well as the ancestral unceded territory of the Anishinaabe-Algonquin Nation. We encourage listeners to visit native-land.ca to learn more about the history of their own territory and to read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.